Good to see everybody. We're going to start off in 2 Samuel chapter 24, so go ahead and jump over to that. We're on our discussion of discipleship, looking at the various aspects of what discipleship is, what it means, kind of breaking it down to kind of look at it piece by piece. By the end of this quarter, we'll kind of do a big run-through of all of it. We'll talk about, I think, in a few weeks about what a disciple ultimately is, taking each one of these weeks piece by piece. But today we're talking about the fact that a disciple is supposed to sacrifice. And so we'll kind of break down the idea of what a sacrifice is, how it applies to a disciple, and we'll kind of make some hopefully good applications throughout the course of that. Before we begin, though, I'm going to ask Mr. Joe Wood, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Dear Father, we are grateful for this another beautiful Lord's Day, a day that we can come together with like-minded saints to study a portion of Thy Word. We pray that You will be with Brady and the other teachers, that the things they have prepared, they can relate to us in such a manner that we can understand them and make the necessary applications in our lives. Pray that You will be with us throughout this class, that we will put the worldly things out of our minds, that we can concentrate upon our purpose for being here. Be with us throughout this class, that we can conduct ourselves in a manner well-pleasing unto You. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Let's start off with the easiest question. What does it mean to sacrifice? If you're saying that you are sacrificing, what does it mean? That was way too quick, but you're exactly right, to give something up. But there's a little bit more to it than that. What does it mean to sacrifice? You give something up for sure. That's valuable. We'll piece this together, a thought at a time, yes. What does it mean to sacrifice? Okay, do so willingly. That's wrong, but good try at least. Yeah, that's right.
I think it should hurt a little.
It should hurt a little, yeah. I like where you looked when you said that. Yeah, sacrificing should hurt a little bit. And that kind of goes back to what Linda mentioned about it being something of value. Yeah.
I think it should hurt a little, and you should be giving something up, but it's for a specific purpose.
Bingo, exactly. That's what I was exactly thinking. When you talk about sacrificing, it's not just giving something up. That anybody can sacrifice something in that regard, giving something up, but it's for ultimately a purpose, and that's kind of what I want to get to when we talk about sacrifice. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, this is at the end of David's life. We'll look at a few verses here, but somebody set the stage for it. What's happening in 2 Samuel chapter 24? This is way after David and Bathsheba. This is way after Goliath. What happens in 2 Samuel chapter 24? I think you just ruined it. That's fine. David takes an unauthorized census. Why is it that the census is unauthorized? And this is near the end of David's life. He would, I think, die at the end of this chapter. Or he would die actually in 1 Kings 2. What was wrong about this census? God didn't tell him to, for sure, right? Why does he want to take the census, though? Egotism, probably. Pride, arrogance, something along those lines. It shows ultimately a lack of reliance on God. He wants to know how many people are under his command, and so he kind of puts his trust in the numbers as opposed to the fact that he has God on his side, who ironically stands up to him in this passage. Anybody remember? Joab does. I don't know who said it. I think it was Travis. Yeah, Joab stands up to him. This is one of those rare shining moments in Joab's life where he actually does the right thing. And so when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 24, the census is taken at the beginning of this. God is obviously very unhappy with it. He gives them 3 options for what the punishment could be. David chooses one of them. But then he has to make a sacrifice. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 18, it says, Gad came to David that day and said to him, Go erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. If you look at the Chronicles account, he uses a slightly different name. Both of them mean exactly the same thing, talking about the same person. Verse 19, David went up according to the word of God, just as the Lord had commanded. Araunah looked down, saw the king and his servants crossing over towards him. Araunah went out and bowed his face to the ground before the king. Then Araunah said, Why has my lord the king come to his servant? Then David said, To buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be held back from the people. Araunah said to David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what is good in his sight. Look, the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, the yokes of the oxen for the wood. Everything, O king, Araunah gives to the king. Araunah said to the king, May the Lord your God accept you. Verse 24, the king said to Araunah, however, No, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. What does Araunah want to do whenever David shows up at his doorstep? Right, give him everything he needs. He wants to give him the threshing floor, he wants to give him the oxen. What does David say back to him? He says no. Exactly. This passage in verse 24 gives sacrifice in a nutshell. He says, I'm not going to offer burnt offerings to the Lord which cost me nothing. Why is it that David doesn't want to do that? It wouldn't be a sacrifice for sure, but why wouldn't it be a sacrifice?
It wouldn't be a sacrifice for David.
Right. It may, yeah, maybe a sacrifice for Aaron. Yeah. Right.
So David would not be fulfilling what he's supposed to be doing.
Right. It wouldn't, as Kevin mentioned earlier, it wouldn't hurt anything from him. It wouldn't cause him any pain. It's certainly not valuable to him. So why is it that David doesn't want to offer to the Lord anything that doesn't cost him anything? What is the whole point of a sacrifice? And we'll get into the Jewish sacrifice a little bit more in a little bit. But what's the whole point of a Jewish sacrifice? Right, to atone or offering something that you have that's valuable towards God who gave you everything. So, when we talk about the nature of sacrifice, it has to hurt. It has to be something from you. If David offered to the Lord an oxen from Aaron, that wouldn't be a sacrifice. That wouldn't mean anything.
That's not David's best.
Right. It was Aaron's best. Right, Aaron comes out glowing in the story, by the way. Aaron is awesome. David wouldn't have offered anything to him. It wouldn't be anything that's valuable to him. This is something that the Israelites over the entire course of the Old Testament never really got. Well, of all of the accusations, of all the condemnations towards Israelites, what is one of those that God says more than anything else about their worship? Anybody remember? And these people were offering sacrifices. The Jews were there.
They worship me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me.
They worship you with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And Jesus would quote that from Isaiah, I think at least 3 times in the New Testament. That's there too. It shows the lack of depth in their worship, the lack of sincerity. But what is it that they do? They offer the sacrifices, but what?
They offer the weakest, not the best.
Right. They offer the weakest. They offer the blemish. That's something Malachi talks about. Look at Isaiah chapter 1. Malachi actually has some very strong words for him. We're not going to look at him, so I'll just kind of reference that for curiosity's sake. But in Isaiah chapter 1, this is one of those books that is huge. Obviously, there's a lot of very vivid imagery. But the very first thing, Isaiah discusses a whole bunch of different subjects. Almost the very first thing that Isaiah discusses is here in chapter 1, verse 10. He says in Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 10, Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What does Isaiah call these people in verse 10? Sodom and Gomorrah. What would that have meant to these people? If you call the Israelites Sodom and Gomorrah, what does that mean to them? Detestable, abominable people, people that are completely immoral. Obviously, that would take them back. But when you look at verses 11 down to verse 13, you see at least the reason why in this regard. He says, What are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams, the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity in the solemn assembly. What is Isaiah charging them with here in Isaiah 1, 11 through 13? Vanity worship, yeah, I think that's a little bit, yeah. What else is he charging them with? Things that look good on the outside but don't really have any substance behind them yet. What is he charging them with? Just going through the motions, exactly. These are people that offer sacrifices because why? They have to, exactly. It's just kind of a part of who they are. And when you look at, especially the book of Leviticus, and we'll get to that, I guess, a little bit, we may not. But when you look at Leviticus, which has a lot to do with the whole animal sacrifices, most of the, at least the early part of the book is about that. And he doesn't waste any time. He hits the ground running to talk about sacrifices, do this, do this, do this. So it is very much ingrained within their system. You can't really blame them for thinking that this is a part of their everyday life. But what have these people missed in the big scheme of sacrifices? Something that David had said here in verse 24. Right. They're offering these sacrifices, but they don't know what it means. And moreover, it doesn't mean anything to them. They're offering, as Shell said, they're offering the worst of the flock. They're going through the motions. The answer, by the way, to verse 12, when he says in this passage in verse 12, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? The answer is God did. God required the sacrifices, but he required the sacrifices, as David mentions, to be worth something. Let me ask you this question. Do we still have the same problem today? See, one nod is from my mom, so I'm not really sure. She's just backing me up on that. Do we have this problem today? Let's narrow it down. Do we have this problem today? Hey, Linda does. Why do we have this problem today? I just want somebody to incriminate themselves. Why do we have this problem today, or how do we have this problem today?
Because you come to church and you go through the motions.
We come to church, we go through the motions.
You worship in truth and not in spirit.
We worship in truth and not in spirit. Yeah, we may sing the songs, but at the end of the song, we A, don't know what the song was, and B, we don't know even what the words we just said were, which is a huge problem. We come when we listen to the sermon and Scott falls asleep, the prayer is being said and we don't really know what was said. So there's a whole bunch of issues with our worship. The Lord's Supper becomes meaningless when we don't give any thought to it. These problems still exist in today's world. What's the solution for that? What's the solution for meaningful worship and sacrifice? Which, by the way, worship and sacrifice are linked in Hebrews 13:5. Offer the fruit of your lips, the sacrifice of your lips, worship to me.
The desire has to be intentional.
Right, the action and the desire has to be intentional. When we come together to take the Lord's Supper, what do we need to focus on? Not lunch, but what? The sacrifice that God gave to us. Exactly. And that's what sacrifice really is. Somebody said that the nature, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said the nature of sacrifice is to realize that whatever you're sacrificing is take the place where you should be. God, in His infinite power, His infinite everything, very easily could destroy us. He doesn't because of His mercy. And so in thanks to that, to atone for our sins, we offer our sacrifices. So all those things kind of play in together. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Let's look at Matthew 16. It's easy to see the faults. I think when we look at Isaiah 1, we see the fault in these people. We can look at Amos 5, for instance. You can look at Malachi 1. There's all sorts of ways that we can see the faults in other people, but I want you to look at Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16 is kind of this contrast. We discussed John 6 at length last week and saw the contrast within the language. But in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 13, I want you to read Peter's, to quote my subtitles, Peter's confession of Christ. Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 13. He says, "Now when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, He was asking His disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets,' all of which, by the way, are amazing figures in the Old Testament. That's not a slight towards Jesus. He asked them, though, in verse 15, 'Who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Jesus said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you,' verse 18, 'that you are Peter. And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven.' Then He warned the disciples, verse 20, very diligently that they should tell no one that He was the Christ." What's the relationship like between Peter and Jesus in these verses? Peter's always known for kind of speaking up first. Sometimes puts his foot in his mouth. What's the relationship like between Jesus and Peter here? He's devoted to God, for sure. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Well, he said that, you know, doesn't seem to be hesitating. He said, "You're the Christ."
Right.
Son of the living God.
Who do people say that I am? Well, some people say you're Jeremiah, some people say you're Isaiah, some people say you're one of the prophets, but who do you say that I am? And He doesn't just say you're Jesus. Who does He say?
You're the Son of God.
Right, you're the Son of God, exactly. That's a declaration that in hindsight makes perfect sense. We look at it 2,000 years later and say, well, of course He would say something like that. What it represents in Matthew chapter 16 is a very vocal expression of faith, a very deliberate expression of faith that not a lot of people in that day and age were willing to make. You see that in John chapter 6 as we discussed last week. So at this point in Peter's life, he's very much devoted to God. He's very much in tune with Him. When you look at verse 21, though, it's almost like the conversation changed. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 21, it says, "From that time Jesus began to show His disciples that He must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised up on the third day." Peter then took Him aside, and I don't think this happens right next to each other, although the text places it by each other. Peter takes Him aside, verse 22, and begins to rebuke Him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Why does Peter rebuke Jesus in this statement? Because he is very sincere, I think.
Still thinks it's an earthly kingdom.
Right, he still thinks he's an earthly king. Why else does Peter rebuke him for this? Right, how could these things happen to you based on everything I've seen? This is impossible for you. Why else is Peter saying this? Why does he say this will never happen to you? What is Peter willing to do?
He has a mind to prevent it.
He's what?
He has a mind to prevent it.
He has a mind to prevent it. Ken?
That's what I was going to say. I mean, literally, he tried to prevent it.
Right, exactly.
When to take him, he was ready to fight.
Right. When we look at this
He
passage,
actually did fight.
right. He took up a sword and was the only one in the garden, by the way, to do that. When we look at this passage, we tend to think of it in broad terms. We say, well, far be it from you, this will never happen to you. In much the same way that Nathan just kind of conceptualized it. You're God, you're the Son of God. This can't happen to you because you're so much powerful and everything. But Peter, I don't think, meant it that way. When you look at the text and he says, this will never happen to you, you see the fulfillment of it in the garden, where Peter literally takes out a sword, takes a swing at one of the high priests, and he's vastly outnumbered, by the way. Peter is willing to do what for Jesus? He's willing to die in the garden for him, and it's Jesus that stays his hand, which is ironic. Well, look at verse 22. He says, this will never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest but man's. Why does Jesus say that to him in that passage?
His human emotions got in the way first,
Right, his human emotions got in the way first.
and not his spiritual emotion.
Right, what he knew physically was getting in the way of what he should have known spiritually. Yeah. What else? Why else does Jesus say that to him? That's a very Django answer, by the way. I was right there with you. Why else does he say it? What is he wanting Peter to do?
The will of God, and he didn't want Peter to, I don't think, influence him, because I don't think he could. But
Right.
he was mistaken in trying to change the will of God.
Right. Peter was trying to actively work against what Jesus said was going to happen. I mean, this is just kind of a fact of it. Peter says, that's not going to happen. I'm going to stop it if nobody else will. What is Jesus asking Peter to do in this passage? Or rather, commanding him to do? Don't stand in the way for sure. What is he asking him to do, though? Keep in mind that idea of sacrifice.
Stand up for God's way.
I'm sorry? Let Jesus be sacrificed. Exactly. With it.
Stand up for God's plan.
Stand up for God's plan. Well, what does that require of Peter? And this is something that every Jew in this day would have had to figure out, especially in regards to Jesus. To submit. But what is he asking Peter to do?
He already knows that Jesus is the Son of God. He has to let him go.
He has to let him go, right? And that's very true. He has to be willing to let him die. But what does he have to sacrifice? I guess that's a better question. What does Peter have to sacrifice?
His own want and desire.
His own want and desire, or his own what?
Pride.
Well, pride too, for sure. Let's get somebody from this section. I feel like I'm kind of going back and forth.
Tell us the first letter.
I will not tell you. You have to figure it out. What does he have to sacrifice?
He has to sacrifice his understanding of what Jesus was here to do.
Bingo. I know I can always rely on this middle section. He has to sacrifice what he thought Jesus was going to be. That's the same thing we have to do today. When people encounter Jesus, and I don't mean that in some kind of Joel Osteen way, but when people first read about Jesus, they think he's going to be this, they think he's going to be that. And what do we have to sacrifice when we read about Jesus?
Preconceptions.
Right. We have to sacrifice what we think about Jesus to see what he truly is. And that's where Peter's at in this passage. And I don't think this text is accidental. If you look at Matthew chapter 16, you see this here in 13 through 20. You see this exchange in 21 through 23. What does Jesus talk about right after this? In verse 24, let's go ahead and read it.
About the nature of sacrifice.
Right, he talks about this. Right, he talks about the nature of sacrifice. So look at verse 24. Jesus then says to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I think that's a direct callback to what he had just said about his own death, burial, and resurrection. Verse 28 or verse 26, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his own soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory together with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. What does Jesus teach about the nature of sacrifice? That every man must do what? And woman, by the way, in case.
Give up their...
They have to give up themselves and people. Well, you didn't really know, you just want to piggyback on the right answer. He says, take up your cross and follow me. What does that mean? Because we tend to think about it in terms of pain, in terms of suffering, but what can take up your cross mean to every one of us? In Peter's instance, what did it absolutely mean? Because it wasn't pain. The problem wasn't pain for him. And it would never be the problem with Peter. What was Peter's cross, for lack of a better phrase, that he needed to sacrifice or take up? Right, he needed to wrap his mind around the spiritual mission of Jesus and see that instead of the physical, and that that you can't just pull out a sword and hack your way through people to accomplish your goal. What does take up your cross mean to some of us? Right. Right. Maybe sometimes we need to sacrifice our life. Sometimes we need to sacrifice relationships. Sometimes we need to sacrifice our job. We sometimes need to sacrifice our comfort level. And that's, you can expound upon that to the nth degree. I think all those things fit within this, wouldn't it?
Knowing what it is that means so much to you, but it hinders you spiritually.
Right.
And that's going to be the hardest thing
Right.
to deal with.
It will be the hardest thing for you to deal with. And when you look at, and this is one of the understated stories of the Gospels, but when you look at Peter's relationship with Jesus, he was steadfastly devoted to Jesus. And not just in a you're my Lord and I'm your disciple kind of way. There was almost a very personal connection between Jesus and Peter. And everything that Jesus does, Peter takes personally. And so for him, it wasn't just, giving up, watching the Messiah sacrificed on the cross. It was watching his friend, somebody he had spent 3.5 years with, that he trusted implicitly the ability, as Kevin mentioned, to let that happen. That was hard for Peter, as you can see in the garden, as you can see at the end of the campfire around kind of the courtyard area. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on that? Yeah, Ken?
Peter writes later in 1 Peter, it's hard for him to do it.
Right.
But they didn't comprehend how that anything good could come from him dying.
Well, that's true,
And
yeah.
even the prophets, the angels didn't understand how he could die, and then it come about to be a profitable thing in the end.
Right. What's the purpose? What's the purpose of your death? What's it supposed to solve? And we take it for granted 2,000 years later and say, well, it solved this, this, and this, and we can look at it in retrospect, but they didn't. So what's the purpose of you dying on a cross? What's the purpose of you being tortured by the Romans? And all those things are questions that he had to answer and that he would find throughout the course of his life. That's an excellent point. Yeah.
And I think whenever he says, take up your cross, the cross was not an easy thing during that time period. It was brutal. So I think it's showing how it's not going to be the easiest thing in the world for you to do what he's asking you to do.
Right.
So you're going to have to work at it, and it's going to be difficult.
Right.
But, so I think the metaphor of the cross in that situation shows.
Yeah. And that's true. And sometimes, whether deliberately or accidentally, we undermine what the cross meant to Jesus. We tend to think that, because he was God in the flesh, the cross really didn't hurt him. And that's a very Gnostic viewpoint, by the way, that the cross didn't really hurt him because God kind of came in and made him supernatural in a way that he didn't feel pain. I think that Jesus felt every nail. I think Jesus felt every lash. But we undermine sometimes what he went through. And to your point, when we make the modern day parallel to something like lethal injection, we say, well, the cross meant to them what it meant to the lethal injection. Not at all. Because the cross was A, death, but it was also being shame, torture, punishment, being spit upon, it was disgrace, everything involved with that you don't see with modern day executions, at least here in America. Yeah.
You covered it very well.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to say that, the cross, we think about the physical,
Right.
the pain and everything, but the cross, it was a shameful way to die.
Right.
Because of stigma.
Because of the stigma, right. And, this actually leads very well to the next point, so thank you, Colton and Howard. But when we talk about Jesus' death on the cross, what we forget, the reason I'm on that tangent, was we forget what it cost Jesus. We forget that it cost him a lot. I read something this past week that I thought was very interesting. It's weird to think that Jesus through creation, created the very tree that he would be hung upon and watched the person that would eventually betray him nail him to the cross. There's all sorts of personal and emotional components to the cross that we don't think about. And so when we think about what Jesus sacrificed, we always go to his death, but we forget about everything else about it. And there's a lot more to it than just that. And you see a really strong similarity, at least in my mind, between not only Jesus and everybody else, but Jesus and Abraham. Think about Abraham's big, trial or whatever it was with Isaac. What happened in that story? What did God ask Abraham to do? Sacrifice your son. But he didn't just say sacrifice your son. What did he say? Sacrifice your son, your what? Your only son whom you love. Why did God phrase it to him like that? He what? Well, that's true. That wasn't thinking of that connection, but that's true too. Because he was going to as well. What did Isaac mean to Abraham? He meant everything, not only his genealogy, but what did it mean to Abraham personally? The promise, for sure, right. Think about this. Abraham became a father at, I think, what, 99, if my memory serves me right. Became a father very, very, very late in life. Sarah became a mother very, very late in life. But all his life, you see shades of him wanting to be a father. When Abraham's brother dies, what does he do? Or what does he do? Right? Who does he adopt, more or less?
Lot.
His nephew Lot, exactly. And he has this relationship with Lot. Lot goes and lives in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not adoption per se in the same sense that we would understand it, but Abraham more or less takes Lot under his wings. Whenever Lot goes away and God says that you're going to have a son, and the genealogy will pour through you, who does Abraham reference? He doesn't reference then Lot after that. Who does he reference then? The only heir of my house is what? Anybody remember? It's kind of a weird name, so if you do, you can get bonus points. Don't have to answer questions for a second word. Eleazar of Damascus. He says the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. God says it's not Eleazar. That's not who the genealogy is going to flow through. And then Abraham decides, from the point A of the promise to be fulfillment, he decides that he's going to help God along. What does he do? Has relationships with Hagar. He has Ishmael. And he says specifically there, after Ishmael is born, please let Ishmael be the one that you have chosen to let the lineage flow through. So Abraham has a lot of emotional fatherly connections way before Isaac shows up. So when God says to Isaac, God says to Abraham in this passage, I want you to take Isaac, your only son whom you love, and sacrifice him. What does that mean to Abraham?
He was following God's direction.
He's following God's directions, but that makes it very objective. And that's true. We should all do that. But what does that mean to Abraham? Yeah.
I think it means he's taking, God tells Abraham, take all your hopes and dreams and poof.
Right. I want you to trust me. I want you to take all your hopes and dreams, everything I've ever told you, and I want you to fully trust me. Hebrews 11 gives a little insight to this. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. I didn't actually expect anybody to get Eleazar of Damascus, by the way. I totally forgot about it during this lesson as well. But he kind of slips in there and shows a little bit of where at least Abraham's at. In Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 17, there's 3 verses here that kind of reveal where Abraham's at this point in his life. Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 17. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, who he had received when the promises was offering his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, and Isaac your descendant shall be called. That's a promise that was made to Abraham, that Abraham would have remembered. Verse 19, Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. That last phrase is important. We'll discuss that a little bit more here in a second. But what does Abraham assume is going to happen when Isaac dies? He assumes that he's going to resurrect him from the dead. Why is that noteworthy at this point? And it never happened at that point. That's what's fascinating about the mindset of Abraham. Today, I don't mean to say that resurrection is commonplace, because it's not. But we read about it all the time in the Bible. They had no knowledge of that even happening. And so when you look at Abraham's faith that he has, as John pointed out, he's asking him to put everything in action that hasn't even happened yet in history. That's a lot of faith. But you see these connections between Abraham and Jesus all over the place. Where does God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son at?
Mount Moriah.
Mount Moriah, exactly. What is Mount Moriah? Which ironically I called back to the beginning of the class. What's significant about Mount Moriah?
Isn't that where God gave the Ten Commandments? No?
My mom's shaking her head, so I'll say no to. I don't know. I can't remember. For some reason, Mount Sinai. Thank you. Thank you, Mom. It's Mount Sinai. You're right. It's not where Moses receives the Ten Commandments. It's where the temple is at, exactly. It's also, by the way, the place where the Jebusite has the threshing floor. So that's kind of a nice callback to 2 Samuel 24. So you have where the temple is going to be, and then you have Abraham supposedly sacrificing him on the same exact location. So you see that tie-in. You also have this idea of a duration. How long does he go into the wilderness? Abraham leaves his servants with Isaac, and he goes into the wilderness for how long? He says, we're going to go here for what? 3 days. Exactly. How long was Jesus in the tomb? 3 days and 3 nights. Joyce, get it right. You also have the participation. Who carries the wood to the sacrifice? Isaac does, exactly. Who carries the wood to the cross? Jesus does. Also Simon of Cyrene, but that's kind of a secondary point. Right, so you have the participation here. You also have the anticipation. What are both of them expecting is going to happen? Well, not the sacrificial animal. What does Abraham and Jesus both anticipate? Or know is going to happen or believe is going to happen?
Resurrection.
Resurrection, exactly. And then you also have the reception, receive you back as a type. So you have the physical act kind of taking place or kind of transitioning to a spiritual type of idea. And I think this connection is very powerful when you look at all of this kind of in retrospect. The temple would eventually become a place where, you know, the Jews could come up and offer sacrifices for sins. There's that idea again. But when God, or when Abraham calls, or when Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac, what does he call it? Does anybody remember? He says this is the place, he says the Lord will what? The Lord will provide. Why is that phrase noteworthy when you talk about the temple and the sacrifices and stuff like that? What is the temple essentially? We talked about this a lot when we discussed Solomon last quarter. What was the temple's purpose? I'm just going to stare at Nathan until he answers. It's a place where they commune with God for sure. But remember, the temple was to have one very specific purpose. In Solomon's dedication of it that he has in 1 Kings chapter 7, he spends 50% of it discussing one idea. What is that idea? I'm sorry, I won't stare at you. It is the house of God, that's for sure, yeah. But what is the purpose of the temple? When people blank, you blank. Oh God. I don't know what's funny about that.
But I do.
Yeah, we're playing hangman more or less.
Renew your faith, but to confess your wrongs and
Thank
give
you.
blessings.
I never thought I could count on you until this moment. Yes, when people sin, hear their cries. When people transgress your laws, this should be a place where you can make that right, where you can offer atonement. So the sacrifices of the Jews is not just this kind of act that they perform. The temple isn't just the glory of God as we sometimes associate with it. It is a very specific place that you can be forgiven of your sins. And so when Abraham calls it on Mount Moriah, the Lord will provide, what is God providing? Forgiveness of sins. He's offering a vehicle by which you can be made right with Him. And that's the whole point of forgiveness. That's the whole point of sacrifices. That's the whole point of the atonement. And if you look at the book of Leviticus, we mentioned it earlier, when you look at the book of Leviticus, there are sacrifices all over the place. How many different types of sacrifices are there in the Old Laws? Anybody know? Any Old Testament scholars? Because they're smarter than I am. Did you say it's terrible? Or we call Linda's guess is terrible?
So many.
There's so many, right? There's so many, right? And there's a ton of them, but they all fall under very specific categories. Remember?
Sin offerings, peace offerings.
That's true. I'll go ahead and skip to it. There are 5 different types of offerings. I actually didn't know, even though we're kind of familiar with various ones of them. The first one is called the Olah, the burnt offering. We're familiar with this one. This is, I think, I can't remember what specific one this one is, but it's the one where you offer sacrifices. The second one is called the Mincha. It's the grain offering. This is the one that doesn't require a death, more or less. This is the one that's just kind of a Thanksgiving offering. Then you have the Shilam, the peace offering. You have after that the Chatzah, the sin offering, and then you have the Asham, the guilt offering. All of these are laid out very well in the first 13 chapters of the book of Leviticus. But why does God have all these different offerings? Because they needed it, that's for sure. Why does God have all these offerings? Because not all of these are for sin. Not all of these are for atonement.
Isn't the old law, isn't it referred to as training in righteousness?
It is, yeah.
So these are all ways of people becoming faithful.
It is right. It is ways for people to become faithful for God, yeah. Why? Well, let me ask you this. If these aren't all sin offerings, what are some of them? They're all free will offerings. Or not all, I'm sorry.
Returning things to God that were actually His
of these are thanksgiving offerings. Not all of these are sin offerings. Some of these are thanksgiving offerings that you offer whenever you need to express your thanks towards God, whether formally or informally. What do all of these have in common? You're all giving something up, exactly. But as Shel mentioned earlier, the nature of sacrifice is to offer your what? Offer your best, exactly. I want you to look at something in Leviticus chapter 1. There's a little nugget in here that oftentimes can get overlooked. I've overlooked it. But in dealing with the sacrifices, and especially at a professional level like the priest would have done, it's very easy, I would imagine, when your job literally every day is to slaughter animals from sunrise to sunset. It can be easy sometimes to become disattached to what's happening. In Leviticus chapter 1, though, there's a very personal nature to this that I think is noteworthy. Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 3. Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it. A male without defect, he shall offer it at the doorway. There's the best of your flock. That's what you're supposed to offer. A male without defect, he shall offer at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. But then something very curious happens in verse 4. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. In case you think this is something that's just specific to the burnt offering, look in chapter 2 and verse 2. You have the oil, you have the fine flour, verse 2. He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall take it from it, his handful of its fine flour and its oil with its frankincense. Look at chapter 3, verse 2. We're talking about the peace offerings. He shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and slay it at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around on the altar. You look at chapter 4, this will be the last one. When you look at chapter 4, verse 4, he shall bring the bull to the doorway of the tent of meeting before the Lord, and he shall lay on his hand on the head of the bull and slay the bull before the Lord. What happens with most of these offerings? Right, there's a laying on of hands. That's not, to, by the way, to transfer the Holy Spirit. That's not what's happening here. But what's the purpose of the laying on of hands? Why does he want you to lay your hand on the bull before you sacrifice it? There's a spiritual idea, and then there's a very emotional idea. It makes it personal. That's the emotional idea. It makes it very personal. This is something that I'm sacrificing that's important to me. I think you see that. Why else is it, on a spiritual level, why is it important to lay your hand on the bull? You kind of push it away from you? Yeah.
Part of the offer is to.
I can see that. It may be a little bit of a symbol. I think it's a different type of symbol. Look in Leviticus 16. This is kind of built up a little more here in this passage. Leviticus chapter 16, this is what we're familiar with when we talk about the scapegoat. We're familiar with that idea in the Old Testament. Leviticus chapter 16, starting in verse 21. Starting in verse 20. It says, when he finishes atoning for the holy place in the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall offer then the live goat. Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the sons of Israel, all their transgressions in regard to all their sins. And he shall lay them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who stands in readiness. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to a solitary land, and he shall release the goat into the wilderness. What happens to that goat? There's two goats. The first one's sacrificed. What happens to the second one? He's gone. He goes off in the wilderness. But what does that symbolize? Being set free, but what does it symbolize to these people?
That their sins
are gone. Exactly. And when you look at verse 21, that describes it to a T. You are literally laying symbolically your transgressions on this goat and sending off into the wilderness. So let me ask you this then. When you look at those first 4 chapters that we just read, what does it mean when you lay your hand on the bull before you sacrifice it? What's spiritually happening in that moment?
You're transferring your transgressions onto that sacrifice.
Symbolically, you're transferring your guilt from yourself to that animal, and you're sacrificing it. That's the nature of sacrifice. That it's a way by which you can be made right with God. By sacrificing, that's something that's very dear to you. And on the flip side of that, what sin does to God is it breaks that covenant. Sin is an emotional, well, not emotional, but sin is a transgression of God's laws. So to atone for that, we have to give up something that's valuable to us. And I think you see that in all of us. Let's look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2 is a nice little parallel. We talk about these passages kind of in isolation. I kind of want to look at them together. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 14, it mentions another type of sacrifice, by the way. Philippians chapter 2, starting verse 14. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. You too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. What other offering does he mention there in verse 17? A drink offering. What is a drink offering? Did you see the same phrase mentioned in 2 Timothy 4? You see Jesus referencing it with the Lord's Supper, my blood is being poured out for you. What is that drink offering? It is, but it's mentioned always in tandem with another offering. It's a libation that you pour out in tandem with something else. So when Paul mentions here in this passage that I'm being poured out as a drink offering, it's a drink offering, or his sacrifice of his life is in addition to the work that he's already done with them, the sacrifices that he's made for them. So that's kind of the more direct parallel that he makes with that. But nevertheless, when you look at Philippians chapter 2 and chapter 3, he discusses this sacrifice on a very intimate level. Who does he discuss in Philippians chapter 2, the first 11 verses?
Christ.
Christ, exactly. What's the point he makes about Jesus?
That he was willing to give up his place in heaven and consider it nothing to come down and be a sacrifice for us.
Exactly. That he was willing to give up his life on the cross and come down, and not just on this cross, but also be made like the form of a bondservant on this earth. So you have the nature of sacrifice here in Philippians chapter 2. You have it epitomized with Jesus, where he not only is very much in pain, what's the whole point of the cross, he also sacrifices his honor, not his deity. That's a very specific delineation that he makes there. And then he also sacrifices any kind of comfort that he would have in his life. So there's a whole bunch of things that Jesus sacrifices with that. When you look at chapter 3, what point does Paul make? Who is he talking about in Philippians chapter 3? He's talking about himself, exactly. And in the exact same tone, in the exact same type of words, he mentions the fact that he gives up his pain, or that he goes through pain for the sake of these people. The fact that he sacrifices honor. This is the whole point of the Hebrew of Hebrews, the Pharisee of Pharisees. I've given all this up. But it's always, he also gives up any kind of comforts he would have in this passage. And so there's all these types of things that he mentions that he gives them up. But to Colton's point earlier, he gives them up for a purpose. Colton's over there now. He gives all these things up for a purpose. In chapter 3, verse 11, his purpose is what? In order that I may attain for the resurrection of the dead. In Philippians chapter 2, what's God's purpose? Or Jesus' purpose when he sacrifices himself? Chapter 2, verses 10 through 11. Right, the resurrection of the dead is in there, but if you look specifically at 2 verses 10 through 11, the thing that he's attaining is the name above all names. The glory, the honor, the title of Messiah, all those things, those are things that he received by nature of the sacrifice. Look at chapter 3. And by the way, this is bookended very well. At the beginning of chapter 2, the end of chapter 3, he says, join in following my example. He kind of compares himself to Jesus in that regard. But in chapter 3, this is what we'll finish up with. In chapter 3, verse 17, he says, as we just mentioned, join in following my example. Observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. For many walk, of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they're enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, whose glory is in their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. For our citizenship, verse 20, is in heaven, from which also we eagerly await for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory, by the exertion of the power that he has, even to subject all things to himself. What is Paul saying there in Philippians 3, 17 through 21? That just as Jesus and Paul sacrificed something, what do we need? Join in following my example. If Jesus sacrificed his pain, if I sacrifice my pain, you also need to sacrifice your pain. You need to sacrifice your honor. You need to sacrifice your comfort level. All of these things are sacrifices that we offer on the altar of God on a daily basis. It's hard to kind of put these in very specific terms because all of us are different. That's the whole point of the take up of the cross. It can mean death, but it can also mean a lot of other different types of things in each every one of us. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments before we end? Yes.
I do think one of the things that God, understanding our human nature and telling us to sacrifice, he understands that when you sacrifice to something, not only does it mean something to you and it gives you intrinsic value yourself, but anything that you sacrifice to or for makes you draw closer to that thing. You now have more value for it because of the fact that you were willing to give up something that mattered to you for it.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. That's actually a really good point, surprisingly, for you to make, because it talks about, when we sacrifice something, we tend to think of giving it up, and that's that. But when you give up something, you're by nature going to be closer to it because you don't want to either anger that thing that you're giving it up for, you don't want to make the same mistake, so it means something to you. David's sacrifice wouldn't have meant anything. I'm not saying he would have committed the same sin, but he really wouldn't have felt the guilt and the punishment had it not been for him paying for it himself, instead of Aaron not kind of paying for it. So I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, Sandra?
Separate all of these things without remembering the promise that God gave to us.
Right.
That our purpose will be rewarded.
Right.
And also that the sacrifice was once and for all.
Right.
Where the law clearly.
Right.
And so it was a way for us to be provided way.
Right. 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 When you look at Jesus' sacrifice and we understand the magnitude of it, what makes us think that we can get through this life without sacrificing anything less than Him? Jesus gave up His very life, His honor, His glory, all those different things. So why should we think that we can be a Christian and be 100% comfortable all our time and never sacrifice anything? That doesn't make sense. And so that's a good point that you bring up. All right, we will pick up next week.